Okay, all happy to move into the next part of our proceedings? Before we turn to the questions, I just want to introduce you to someone who's in the audience. Eric, do you want to come up the front? I want to introduce you to a man named Eric Paul, who comes to politics in the pub from time to time, but particularly tonight I'd like him to say a few words to you about his new book, because he's written a number of books about political economy, imperialism, peace and war, and his new book is called Australia in the US Empire. Eric, would you like to tell us a little about this new book?
Okay. You can't pull it any further. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. And so the book that I'm referring to was published just a month ago, and it's the title is Australia in the U.S. Empire, and basically it's a book that is relevant to the discussion tonight. But essentially the book looks it's an analysis of Australia's relations with the United States. So it is the Australian political economy in its relations with the United States. And it argues that Australia is part of the US imperial project. And I think, so the context is global, and its reference is in the global system in the sense that it is relevant today because we're faced with a crisis. The system is in a state of crisis. But basically the US imperial project is a project for global planetary dominance or hegemony. And that has to be understood in that context. And so it's a very ambitious project. And it has two geostrategies. The first one is the construction of a neoliberal global economy. And this is often referred to as globalization. And the interrelated strategy is the global military dominance, in the sense that the United States has established its global military dominance in order to carry out this project, and so the military is used in order to basically as part of the globalization project is to force compliance to the geostrategies of globalization. So military dominance becomes a very critical aspect of it. So military dominance is about military interventions for compliance, and it is about punishing those who move away from the guidelines and the authorities of the United States. The United States has established, in a sense of leadership, that it has a role to play. It has a universal role to play, and it argues that it is a moral leader and it has the right to do so, and carries out this program. And in that sense, Australia is very much part of that project. And it is part of the global free trade project, and also part of the military aspect of it. And it's very dangerous because it is going to lead to more military interventions, to more wars, and to more conflict. Now, the part of the problem is that the system and the project is in crisis. It's not working. And so we're faced with this systemic crisis in the global system, in the capitalist world economy, as it were. And it is not working because there are too many losers, not enough winners, and the system is just not delivering the goods. And there's more resistance, more challenges to the system. And so in that sense, it is a challenge to Australia to regain its sovereignty, to regain some sort of independence in its foreign policy. Now, the problem is that the danger for Australia is that it undermines its democracy and security. So if Australia wants to get involved in more wars, it's going to be extremely costly. And so increasingly it will be involved in a series of conflict and confrontations, particularly with Russia and China. And the question is, it's going to be also terribly expensive in terms of military expenditures and the obligation that it has towards the United States. And so in that sense, the book argues that Australia should sever its military obligations and its military treaty and alliance with the United States. It should also renegotiate its free trade agreement, because certainly it's not working for Australia. So this is basically the argument of the book. And the best way to, I would imagine, to have a look at it is to ask your local library to get an e-book, an e-copy. And it's published by Palgrave Macmillan, and local libraries would have access to it. And it's unfortunately, the hard copy is quite expensive. It is ridiculous, yes. And this is part of the problem in terms of free trade and the obligations and the cost of carrying out this project. But basically, we're talking about a world system, a world capitalist economy which is in trouble and which is into a systemic crisis. And it's a very severe crisis. And given also climate change and the threats of global climate, the changing global climate, it makes it a very important question for all of us to address and to get active in considering the cost to Australia and what we need to do. And we basically need to regain control over the state and regain control over foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Let's move into question time, beginning with a question from Joe Nagy.
Thank you. You know what was wrong with your presentations? I'll tell you what's wrong right now. You haven't been to see enough World War II movies in which America always won the war. But seriously, my question is this. Isn't the reason that this is happening to Australia because you feel you owe America a debt for saving its country? That sounds pretty ridiculous. I just wonder how you address that. Thank you.
I think we've well and truly paid the debt, and I don't see why 70... I acknowledge that 70 years ago, America appeared to be the saviour of Australia. One point I will make, the invasion that everyone imagined was going to happen was absolutely ruled out by the Japanese High Command. Absolutely ruled out. It was logistically impossible. And to my mind, that impossibility continues to this day. The difficulties of invading a continent of the size of Australia with the long supply lines you'd need to have if you're an invading nation are just colossal. Ludicrous. So I'd say I think the debt's been well paid, and I don't think we have to keep on paying it. And I mentioned that it's a bit like keeping on paying insurance premiums, but it's turning into a protection racket.
No, I don't agree at all. I think that we're, in terms of the debt, I mean, I think we're well through that. I mean, there's a degree of paranoia and angst about devils and demons out there and enemies, particularly Muslim fundamentalists, and I think that America is still perceived as a great and powerful friend, and people want that.
Okay, thank you very much for your informative talk. John Pilger's documentary, The Coming War on China, demonstrates that the South China Sea is a potential flashpoint and the United States is adopting an aggressive posture. The Australian media has been full of alarming and alarmist stories about China's expansion into the South China Sea and the base building in the Spratly Islands, for instance. However, there is little news and even less analysis about the forward bases that the US has in the region. all with nuclear and non-nuclear missile capability, and all within close striking distance of every major Chinese city. According to John Pilger, quote, "The United States has almost 1,000 military bases around the world, covering every continent, every ocean. China has one." So why then is the Australian government so willing to back the US in its aggressive encirclement and containment of China, given the fact that China is Australia's largest trading partner?
Okay, thanks to the speakers. My point is regarding the campaign, what we can do about the question of US bases. And I want to foreshadow the best opportunity we've had for many years, and that is Donald Trump is coming to Australia in November. And now we remember that when Bush came to Australia in 2007, we had a fantastic mobilisation against Bush, and I think, Obama put us to sleep for about 8 years, and meanwhile continued with the US imperialist interventions in various places, got us into continue with Afghanistan. But I think we've got an ideal opportunity now with Trump coming to highlight not only the question of bases, but a whole lot of issues, including refugees and the treatment of immigrants and racism and so on. But maybe Nick could comment on that. This, I think, is an ideal opportunity for all the movements in Australia to focus on this guy who sort of epitomises, we've got a target now. And, that's what you need for a campaign. You've got to have a political target that you can focus on. There's an opportunity for a massive campaign, including the campaign against the bases, when Trump comes here, and he's coming to Sydney. Thanks.
Yeah, Brian Concannon. Yeah. I'm just wondering, what are your views on what credibility does the US actually have when it's came out that they apparently drop bombs every 12 minutes illegally around the world by drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen and other places that have been deemed enemy territory because they've got a bit of resistance. And also the jihadi element in Syria, Iraq, it's come out that the US is actually funding ISIS, Al-Qaeda, for their own means. ISIS is a great way for regime change. What are your thoughts on that? It's come out publicly, it's out there. We need some responses.
I'd just like to say something about the South China Sea. I'd like to point out that the major trade routes between Australia and China do not pass through the South China Sea. They go to the east of the Philippines. Our oil comes from the Middle East. That also does not pass through the South China Sea. The South China Sea is a furphy. It is not of major strategic significance to Australia. Okay?
Only in as much as it's China's marine outlet.
Certainly it is China's, yes. And I'd also like to point out that certainly the news of the militarization of those islands in the South China Sea did not reach us until after the announcement of the pivot to the Asia Pacific. They announced the pivot in 2011, and the first news that I saw about militarizing islands in the South China Sea wasn't until about 2014, I think. Okay? So which was the cause and which was the effect? I believe those militarized islands are actually defensive rather than offensive. They're protecting the sea routes for China's benefit. Nothing to do with Australia.
Hands on China. Hands on Russia.
With regard to Trump, I just think to make him the target is crap. I mean, he's a nasty, misogynist scumbag, racist, and daily presents this sort of stuff. But he represents the interests of powerful corporate deep state. And I do think that with the left, when they confront Trump, must confront him in terms of that bigger picture. With regard to the South China Sea, I'm not at all sure. What? Oh, well, not only a racist, scumbag, chauvinist prick, I mean, what do you want? I mean, our attention being dedicated to the awfulness of this man is totally inappropriate. Vast bunches of American working class support the nasty prick. I mean, that's the fact of it. And they do it because they think he's doing a job for them. Yeah, okay. Back to the South China Sea. I'm not at all sure that Australia is all the way with the Yanks on this. I mean, in the issue of the Taiwan Straits years ago, even I hate to say the word, but John Howard said, no, we're not going to go to support the Yanks if Chinese brought Taiwan back into their country. And I don't think in the South China Sea Australia would be that stupid. I just don't.
My question is not to the speakers, but to everyone who's listening. I think there's a lot of consensus here tonight about what we think about the US Marines in Darwin and the Force Posture Agreement, which enables the Americans to position bombs and ammunition and fuel depots up in the north and position themselves for projection into Southeast Asia, making Australia just as a base for their activities. That's all they're doing, and we're just sitting down allowing it. But we're not going to allow it, and this is the whole point. The speakers have said how Australia is involved in this and that, and this is our position with the US. Is that the way we want it to be? That might be the way it is, but what are we going to do about it? IPAN, which I also represent with Nick, a representative for the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, have got a couple of campaigns and things going. One of them is to try and get a leaflet in a letterbox. There's as many houses in Sydney and Newcastle, because I come from Newcastle. We've distributed 10,000 already. We're looking for people who can put an hour of their time in as a peace worker to put 250 leaflets in letterboxes where you live or roundabout, right? And I've got a list here where you can put your name down. It's a very simple thing to do. We have to go to grassroots and explain these issues and try and get some support from there. It won't happen at the top. The Liberal Party and Labor Party are joined at the hips, as you know, on this issue. And the mainstream just follows along behind them. The only change is going to happen from below. And we have to get people on side. We have to explain, because they're being kept in secret. It's a secrecy matter. They don't tell the public what's going on. If you'd like to be involved in that campaign, I'll pass this around. We'd really like to have your help to do a little bit of work. An hour or so is all you need to get around. And the campaign is asking the people who get the leaflet in the letterbox if they'd like to donate a pair of boots and leave it at the letterbox. And the following weekend, we collect the boots, because the whole idea is to give them the boot. So later on in the year, there'll be a big rally outside a defence establishment place, and we're going to have a truckload of boots delivered outside there and tell them to give them the boot, okay? Anyway, that's something we could do. On next Saturday too, outside the Queen Victoria building where that statue of the old woman is, we're having a rally about opposing the weapons industry, that the government is actually promoting the export of weapons to other parts of the world.
War is a racket. Malcolm Turnbull's making us part of that racket.
He and Chris Pine, yeah. And they're allocating $3.8 billion to promote a weapons export industry. I think most of you know about that, don't you? Yeah, $3.8 billion of taxpayers' money, which could be used, in far more socially useful purposes, whether it's hospitals or education or fair go for pensioners or for the homeless or whatever. $3.8 billion is very useful money from our taxpayers' money. And to use it to promote weapons export is morally reprehensible. One of the places that Chris Pine wants to send the weapons to and sell them to is the Middle East, as if there weren't enough weapons there already. Anyway, that's a rally. We're going to burn the government's weapons catalogues. They have a catalogue of weapons you can buy overseas. They take it to the embassies overseas. They promote it to other countries and their diplomats. And this war weapons catalogue is going to be burnt outside the Queen Victoria building there, and when we have a rally next Saturday at midday. If you'd like to come along and support, we're giving out leaflets about it to everyone that's there and asking them to send a message using your mobile phone to Chris Pine and to Turnbull. Thank you.
While we're on the topic of campaigning, I wonder if anyone else has got anything to contribute about how we might actually take some effective action. Jim, for example, you talked about the impending visit of Trump himself. Any thoughts on what actually is going to happen around that, or what could or should?
Well, I just wanted to say that, okay, fair enough. I don't want to have an argument with Andrew about it, but the point is this is an opportunity, and in fact there is discussions going, I know, among various people about the formation of a committee to organise a huge rally, and that is an opportunity, irrespective of, you know, the argument about what Trump actually represents or whatever. The point is it's an opportunity to take a huge swipe at the US-Australia alliance, which is in effect, I mean, he's going to, talking of failed, you know, such failed states, the APEC conference is in Papua New Guinea, and he's passing through Australia on the way to Papua New Guinea in November. And of course he'll be meeting in Turnbull, they'll be shaking hands with George Bishop. It's an ideal opportunity to highlight the basis issue, and yeah, there is going to be, I can assure you, it's already, you know, the discussions are underway. Watch this space, there'll be publicity starting to come out, you know, at some time in the next period. Of course, there'll be a total lockdown of the centre of Sydney. We know what happened when George Bush came here. They tried to have a special zone, but still there was a huge mobilisation, and this time it'll be much bigger, I think, because it'll bring in the women's movement, it'll bring in you know, anti-racist movement, refugees, and I think it's an opportunity for the anti-racist campaign as well. So yeah, let's do it.
I might also add just a thought of my own, actually, which comes from Andrew and I's involvement in the Evatt Foundation. I think it's pertinent to remember that H.V. Bert Evatt, was possibly Australia's greatest ever international statesperson. As President of the General Council of the United Nations at the time when the Declaration of Human Rights was established. I mean, he is a towering figure. I mean, in terms of domestic politics, he was, some would say, a bit of a loser. But on the world stage, he was a very significant Australian. And he always took the view, as I understand it, that Australian foreign policy ought to be more independent. That we, of Britain, or as it now turns out, the United States, to which we seem to be so wedded as deputy sheriff or whatever is your metaphor. The notion that Australia could be a exemplar, even a leader of middle-sized nations who are interested in peace, who don't want to be part of imperialist projects of the sort that Eric and Andrew have described. Is it possible to, notwithstanding the current policies and personnel of the two major political parties, to envisage that could get up as part of the new imaging, the new positioning of Australia in regard to the world in which we live, as an independent nation leading small and medium-sized powers in a broader coalition which is challenging the imperialist project and putting forward strong arguments for a peaceful and sustainable world. That vision that Evatt had maybe now is timely to reconstruct and re-promote. I'm saying all these things basically because Andrew's told them to me, and I think it's a very strong argument. So some kind of mixture of the campaigning, but also that broader principle that it should inform our politics.
Yeah. I think in connection with the campaigning, I'll certainly be there with you, Jim, when Trump comes over. But my feeling is that there's a much bigger campaign than just dealing with Trump's personality. because if you knock down Trump, another one will...
Dealing with his personnel.
Deep
Well,
state to deal with.
There is the deep state to deal with. That's exactly right. Yeah, and that's what I'm hoping we're going to do with the Give 'em the Boot campaign. And Bevan and I have got no illusions about it being a very long-term campaign. It's not going to be a fly-by-night thing. I mean, it's going to take us a long time to get enough boots together, but we're in it for the long haul.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, I should have actually put a lot more into this talk with regard to my previous work on Evatt and his legacy. So I recommend checking out the Evatt Foundation website, because an article I've written on the legacy is in there, and other material about the importance of his work. Thank you.
Dennis Doherty, anti-basis campaign. Look, the last 2 days have been quite shocking. 2 days ago, we were told that $7 billion was going to be spent on drones, and today we find out that the Army is going to be involved in civil disputes. Now, these are developments that are absolutely frightening and are happening all the time. And this is what anti-bases and IPAN are involved in. These are these are not sort of Trump arriving in Sydney and we all get excited and then he goes away and 2 days later we've forgotten about it. There are 50 US bases in Australia, 50 US bases. There are Marines in Darwin. It's not only the Marines who come. They bring their tanks and they fire in a range in south of Darwin. They bring their planes and they bomb.
Kick them all out.
This is it's not just a few soldiers. It's troops and tanks and live firing, and that this creates a toxic legacy. The toxic legacy of the military. It's an ongoing campaign. There's so many things going on all the time where the military just has an open slather. The whole of even big business says that New Start is not enough. And all we need is $3 billion to increase the price of New Start. But we can't find that. But we can find $7 billion for drones not to find out what's happening to the Great Barrier Reef, but to find out what's happening in the South China Sea. These are our sort of warped priorities, and these are the things that are happening on a fairly regular basis. And so that's why there are organisations like Anti-Bases and IPAN, and I urge you to sort of get involved or be on the edges of those groups, looking at their websites, their Facebook pages and so on. This is a really important thing, and our money is going on those wasteful things when there's so many needs in Australia. And finally, to quote Tim Costello, there's always money for guns. There's never money for health. There's never money for education. There's never money for welfare. And that's sort of writ large over the last 2 days. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much,
This would have been obvious back in the 1980s, and I half expected Dennis to say it, but of course, all of these things are nuclear targets. Pine Gap's probably the #1 nuclear target on the entire planet. Northwest Cape is an extremely high priority nuclear target, and every time we get a new US base, we are painting another bloody nuclear target on our backside for North Korea or China or Russia to bomb the crap out of. Every time we do this, we decrease our own security and make it more and more likely that we'll all get vaporised. Now, if the date was 1983 or even 1988, all of this would not need saying or would have been said by a dozen people. I think the point does need to be reiterated.
Final word from our two speakers before we wind up the session.
Oh, Jim, I certainly don't want to disparage any campaign around Trump. I think it's a terrific opportunity. I just wanted to say that translating that into the bigger picture of the reality of the threat to Australia in terms of sovereignty, and the question of the role in which the American state is operating is fundamental to that campaign. And I just want to say that the heartfelt commitment that I have to trying to get the left to be thinking in the bigger picture that the characters, not individuals or personalities. It's a class issue and a class power issue that we have to confront. Thank you.
I'll just finish with another plug for the Given the Boot campaign. On the 17th of July, we're sort of officially launching the campaign. That'll be in the Teachers Federation building at 6:30. And you can pick up a flyer before you go. And make sure you've got some old boots put aside somewhere.
Give them the boot. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attendance, your questions, your involvement in this process. And our next week's presentation is on the topic of Chinese suppression of the Uyghur people, the minority ethnic group in China. But I imagine that too will broaden out into a broader discussion about China and our understanding of what's happening in that country. So that should be interesting. We'll have as the principal speaker Peter Harcher, the political editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. So a good opportunity to hear a leading Herald journalist talking about one of the big issues of the era. So hope to see you next week. But meanwhile, please join me in thanking our two excellent speakers.